All good.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So everybody at home, here is how this is going to work. Renee is going to talk to us a little bit about what kelp is, why she studies it, why she likes it. And from there, it's all really up to you to ask your questions. Whatever you are curious about, that's what we're going to talk about. So feel free to submit questions while we're talking or after, well, as we're getting into the questions, using the Q&A function. If you use the chat, it's harder for us to keep track of where the questions are going. So if you have questions for me or for the Skype a Scientist program broadly, go ahead and put it in the chat. If you have questions about kelp or marine science, put that in the Q&A. We will try to get to as many questions as we humanly possibly can today. And we're glad you're all here with us getting curious. So Renee, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. I'm Rene Francolini. I am a PhD student based out of the University of Maine and Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences in Booth Bay, Maine. And I am currently a second-year student working on the question, why and how are kelp forests responding to climate change? So our climate is changing, and kelp forests are a really vital ecosystem along the coast of Maine and elsewhere in the world. So understanding how our kelp forests are responding to the climate change will allow us to be really intelligent and smart going into the growing aquaculture business, as well as how to just overall manage our ecosystems better moving forward.
Very cool. What does it mean? What is aquaculture?
Aquaculture is similar to agriculture. Agriculture is growing of crops and food on land. Aqua is the water version of that. So aquaculture can include folks who do oyster farming or cohog farming, or as a growing industry is now the kelp farming would be considered aquaculture.
Cool. So when we grow a bunch of kelp, like what are we using that for? Is that something that I'm personally eating in my seaweed salad? Is it something that we're feeding animals? Like what would be the purpose of growing a bunch of kelp?
Yes, both of those, all of those. Yes, so kelp has been a food popular in a lot of Asian cuisine. You'll have it in your ramen soup, you have it wrapped around your sushi, and folks are getting more and more creative with using it here in the US as well, where you're seeing more kelp-based smoothie products. You're seeing alternatives for plant-based protein burgers and such. And folks are making kimchi out of it and seaweed salad, but then also feeding it to livestock and putting it elsewhere in our environment. So by understanding our wild kelp beds, we can be more intelligent for those uses in the future.
Very cool. I thought I read one time that kelp was, when you feed kelp, or it might have been a different kind of seaweed than kelp, but some kind of seaweed to cows, their burps and farts make less of like the greenhouse gases, so the gases that go into our environment and make the world hotter. Do you work at all with that? Because that is such a fun piece of information.
I don't, but I think that that's fascinating, and I think that that is a big use of kelp, is if we can incorporate kelp into the diets of our livestock, then it could end up having some downstream effects with the methane produced and with all the greenhouse gases produced from our livestock. But I definitely stay in the marine environment of it all, and I've yet to really transition into the applications on land yet.
Very cool. So what specific questions are you trying to answer with your work?
So the first big question I'm asking is just, what does it look like in the coast of Maine? So the kelp forests are really well studied in California and in Australia, and we just don't have as much information about the kelp forests here in Maine. So the first main question is, where are they and how many populations of kelp are there along the coast? By understanding each individual population has some different genetics. They might have different traits. So some might be taller, some might be wider. And so being able to know how diverse the populations are across our coast here, it means that we can help maintain that diversity. A more diverse ecosystem leads to a healthier ecosystem because you need some genetic diversity to keep it stable and alive. And the more inbreeding there is, the less healthy it is.
Right.
So my first question is just, what does it look like? Do we have 2 unique populations, or are there 10 unique populations?
Right.
And then after that, my next big question is, what drives the health of these systems? So what are the really important abiotic or non-living factors that drive the health of the kelp forest? Is it the temperature of the water, the amount of nutrients in the water, the carbon, the whatever it might be? There's a lot, currents might drive it. And so it's determining what factors help influence the success of these forests. And then the final piece is putting that all together. We know what we have in here now. We know what drives healthy versus unhealthy kelp forests. What will it look like in the future? Give it 20 years, 50 years. How can we project the future of what the kelp forests will look like and what the associated ecosystems and organism communities will be?
Very cool. Awesome. That sounds super important. So out in California, whenever I think of kelp forests, I admittedly think of California. Their PR over there, those California kelp forests are really working overtime. So we think of like sea otters hanging out in the kelp forests, and the sea otters eating sea urchins. And when there are no otters, the urchins kind of just like wreck the forest. Okay, I have a couple questions. One, is the kelp in California the same species of kelp that's living in Maine, or is it different?
Different.
Okay, so is it just like the whole ecosystem is entirely unique? It's just that they both happen to be kelp?
So they're similar in the sense that in California, you have macrocystis.
Okay.
And in the Northwest Atlantic and Northeast Atlantic, we have laminarias. So we have Laminaria digitata, and we have Saccharina latissima is in Laminaria. Saccharina latissima is your sugar kelp.
Oh.
There's a few key differences between the West Coast and the East Coast kelp forests. The macrocystis, the ones out in California, are big canopy forming kelps. So they have these air pockets in them, and they create kind of this 3D structure that you could kind of see from outer space, and creates the visual that you can see in the picture from satellites. And so those are very tall. The ones in our coast here, they're still tall and form these 3D structures, but they don't have any air pockets. So they kind of just like flow with the current. They're not always straight up and floating towards the surface of the ocean. Right. And regarding otters and sea urchins, so the otters never migrated over to the Northwest Atlantic, but we had a similar structure of species and trophic ecosystems in the past. So instead of otters, we had these big codfish that were the main consumers in this and the main predators in this ecosystem. And years ago, we overfished all of the cod. And so the cod no longer there, the green sea urchins took over. And so similar to the West Coast, you had a predator that was keeping the sea urchin population down, and thus the kelps were thriving. But then when the otters on the West Coast were removed, or the cod on the East Coast, the sea urchins suddenly exploded because nobody was eating them. And that meant that the sea urchins could eat all the kelp. And so we have a similar trophic ecosystem and balancing of organisms, but different organisms filling in those roles.
Right. Very cool. We've got a question here from Todd Woolley. You've basically just gone over for us both the trophic differences, and trophic, for anybody at home who doesn't know, that's like how different things who eat different things, like how different organisms who eat each other how that's all structured and who's eating who and that sort of like unit. So that's like a trophic cascade, a trophic network. And so our question from Todd is, you've just compared California and Maine ecosystems, both in the species present and trophic issues that both have experienced. How similar or different are the Australian kelp forests?
So Australian kelp forests are a more similar species to the California kelp forests. They're also in the genre Macrocystis. So when we talk about species, it goes kings play chess on fine green silk. Kingdom, phylum, class, order,
genus,
family, genus,
yeah.
species.
Yeah.
So the more narrowly down they're related. So basically our California coast is Macrocystis, Necrocystis, and then the Australian is Macrocystis acolonia. So those are more related to each other than our main kelp forests are. And these kelp forests, still similar to Maine and California, provide an ecosystem and a 3D structure for animals, fish, organisms to live off of and survive in and feed in. And they're facing similar issues with climate change and marine heat waves, kind of altering the structure and where they are located due to the abilities for these species to tolerate different heat thresholds and different abiotic thresholds.
Very cool. Thanks. So yeah, one thing that I think is not necessarily intuitive for when you're first learning about how things are all related to each other in the ocean and in the world broadly is that things that are like not necessarily closer to each other on a globe can be more related to each other because of water connectivity. So something that's in Japan and California or Australia and California may be more related to each other than something that to us on land may seem closer, like Maine and California. So that's something that I learned a long time ago, but at the time I was like, whoa, like that, they both seem like United States species. So maybe they should be more similar, but not even close, because if Pacific Ocean connectivity is easier than Atlantic Pacific connectivity.
Yeah.
Life lesson. Anyway, so the next question is from Lisa Cheney. Does garbage kill kelp?
I mean, I don't know if garbage directly kills kelp, but it can in the sense that if you have a lot of garbage in the water and it might be limiting how much light is getting to the kelps, and the kelp needs light for photosynthesis and to survive, or if the garbage is affecting fish and other species that rely and help the kelp grow by being able to eat the detritus, clear it off, hiding it. So it's not a direct effect, but there's definitely some indirect connections that can be detrimental to the health.
Cool, thank you. The next question is from Gio. How tall does kelp grow? And can you show us what kelp looks like?
Yes, so kelp, the two species that I study are right here. We have our Laminaria digitata and our Saccharina latissima. And some of the biggest kelps I've seen this year is this Saccharina latissima. And for reference, I am 5'6" without my arms stretched out. So I think that this kelp was a solid 6+ feet long. And some of the Laminaria digitata I got, again, in that picture, pretty big. And so they grow, Laminaria digitata has a longer lifespan than Saccharina latissima, but we've been collecting some that are up to 6 feet, 7 feet with the stipes, which are the stems that I'm holding right there. That's the stipe. And then the fronds, which are like the leaves in a sense. So they can get real big.
Very cool. Cool. All right. The next question is from Hazel Vine. I know a lot of the benefits of sea farming. Are there any downsides to sea farming?
Like everything, there's a downside if we do it without thinking. So just like fishing, just like growing any crop on land or in the water, there's a downside if you do it such that the seed we are getting from the wild kelp farms is depleting the wild kelp forest such that they can't actually grow. Or if you're doing it such that you're not thinking about where your kelp farm is located and what factors it might have on the growth of other organisms and life around it, or if you do it too enthusiastically, like folks in the past, we have histories of overfishing certain stocks of fish. But there's no real downside to doing it if you do it using a little brain power.
Right, right. Sounds good. All right, our next question, does photosynthesis work the same with kelp as with plants on land?
It does.
Cool, great. Next question is from Lisa. When did you start to study the kelp forest?
I personally started to study the kelp forests about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. I was always interested in them. I thought that it was fascinating. I always like doing research that is close to home in a sense. And the fact that the kelp forests are literally on the coast and you can see them through the water and they are so directly connected to our livelihoods and welfare is fascinating to me. So I was doing some more deep ocean research before I shifted lanes a bit. And then I moved up to Maine and dove right in.
Awesome. Sounds good. We've got a really cool question here from Nancy. How does carbon sequestered from kelp compare to carbon sequestered from terrestrial plants? And before you answer that, I want to explain what the heck that question means for any of our younger folks who are listening. So carbon is, carbon dioxide specifically, is in our atmosphere, right? All in the air above where we are hanging out right now. And that is one of the things that's contributing to climate change because it's trapping the heat in. And so one of the things we talk about a lot is how to take that carbon dioxide from the air, bring it down, and then keep it down. And that's effectively what carbon sequestration is, like getting it out of the air, pulling it down, and then somehow keeping it, whether we're burying it or just putting it into like plants and animals. Okay. Now, how does that compare kelp to land plants?
We have so much to learn about that. And it's a hot topic right now because a lot of folks are talking about kelp carbon sequestration and the ability to use kelp and kind of trap it on the bottom of the ocean or different ideas there. But there's a lot of basic research we don't know the answers to yet. And so I am personally wary about kind of putting the cart before the horse when it comes to that, because there's a lot of folks currently trying to figure out really how much carbon sequestration kelp can do and what the benefits will be. So we don't really know the answer to that yet, but when we figure it out, if there are ways that we can use that to our advantage, that would be amazing.
For sure. Awesome. And if you're at home and thinking like, that's the question for me, for my life, then you have to become, you don't have to, you could become a scientist and answer questions that we just don't know the answers to yet. All right. The next question is from Trenton. What animals use kelp for non-eating purposes besides otters?
Great question. So here in Maine, we see a lot of little critters kind of hiding within the holdfasts of the kelps. And holdfasts are similar to the roots of a tree. Our kelps, here's a rock. It kind of grows little tendrils that hold on to the rock. And that's how they anchor themselves in the environment. And so you'll often see a lot of little starfish, a lot of crabs, a lot of lobsters, and other critters using those little intricate areas to hide, to shelter themselves. You'll see a lot of juvenile fish will use it to hide from larger fish that are predating upon them. Kelp also acts as kind of a buffer. So it slows down the wave action and it creates it a more safe environment for organisms to live in. So a lot of the juvenile fish and the smaller critters will like being amongst the big fronds and stipes of the kelps because it kind of lessens the effect of the ocean, which can be very rough sometimes.
Very cool. All right, well, thank you. The next question is from Ms. Goldman's class in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Can all kelp live in the same types of water?
No. So some kelp like it a little bit warmer, and some kelp thrive in a slightly saltier environment. So the ocean has different levels of salinity, and that can drive the survival of kelp species. And so that's why it's going to be interesting to see, as our climate changes, which kelps adapt to these changing climates, because not all kelp is created the same.
Right. Cool. Sounds good. All right. Our next question is from Queen Anne Elementary, fifth graders. Here we go. Our fifth grade class is about to start a research project on a topic of our choice. When did you know you were passionate about kelp and wanted to explore more?
I think that it was less of a passion about kelp, and I was always passionate about the environment around us since I was a kid. I went to Nature Day camp. I volunteered counting horseshoe crabs. Like, I just loved being outdoors, and I loved seeing all the critters around my feet and seeing how everything was connected. And so that definitely started when I was very young, but I didn't really know about kelp forests until a few years ago. So even though I knew that I wanted to work within the marine biology field and I wanted to study our environment, and I loved thinking about how genetics and math play into our environment, kelp was an ecosystem that I somewhat stumbled upon just because it was something that needed answers.
Right. Very cool. Yeah, so sometimes you can start being super young and really, really liking a thing, or you can kind of go where the questions exist. And both are totally reasonable ways to find where you end up in science. The next question is from Lori. What benefits does kelp have over land plants?
I don't necessarily know if there's a big benefit of kelp versus land plants, because they each have their own use in their environment. It's similar to saying that kelps are, let's say, similar to the Amazon rainforest, where you have these big trees and they support life and growth and allow carbon dioxide turning into oxygen, photosynthesis. So they have a lot of similar attributes, and it just so happens that they are in different environments.
Right. Right.
So
if you're in Ohio, it's going to be land plants. If you're off the coast of Maine, it's going to be kelp. It's all about, where you are, what you have going on to pick which you grow. The next is from Lindsay. Are there any programs being proposed to increase the cod population for Maine kelp forests to help with the green sea urchin populations?
Not that I currently know of. We're at a state where we are still in a kelp forest state and not necessarily a sea urchin barren state, which is what happens when the sea urchins completely demolish the kelp. And what happened around the 1960s, 70s or so is that the sea urchins, a fishery appeared for them. And so folks started gathering the sea urchins and thus minimizing the effect that they had on kelp. So it is less of sea urchins driving the population of the kelp forests right now, and more of the changing climate and the presence of what we call turf algae, which is shorter, tuftier, less big, less 3D structure filled algae kind of taking the kelp's place.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, I don't think that there's much of a drive for bringing back the cod population to control the sea urchin population.
Yeah. Although I think, and this is admittedly pulling from knowledge that I got back in like 2010, but there's the cod has been a managed fishery for sure. So it's not as though we're not paying attention to cod populations at all. It's absolutely what we call a managed fishery. So a species of fish that we're paying attention to, that there are limits on how much you can catch, sizes that you can catch, that sort of thing. Because back like 150 years ago, cod were like 5 times bigger than what we catch today. Honestly, if not more. And so they're something that we've taken way too many of, and there are absolutely people working on having more healthy cod populations generally, even if it's not specifically for the kelp forests, it's just for their populations in general, for us to be able to eat in the next generation, and also for just like general ecosystem things. So people are paying attention, but it may not be a kelp forest directed thing. The next question is, what can you make out of kelp?
A lot of things. I make ramen out of kelp, or I put kelp in my ramen. There's one of the biggest distributors here in Maine is Atlantic Sea Farms will make sauerkraut out of kelp and kimchi out of kelp, and kelp smoothie ice cubes, kind of to replace your spinach or your kale in your kelp. So anything you really want to. Folks are starting to try to make distill kelp and put kelp in beers and other like alcohols. So there's options. There's room to be creative with it.
Awesome. Sounds good. The next question is from Trenton. How long can kelp live for?
So Saccharina latissima, which is the sugar kelp that I study, lives for like 3 to 4 years. And Laminaria digitata, which is the horsetail kelp, can live longer than that, like 10 years or so. But currently what we're seeing is that we're getting a shorter lifespan due to the fact that they are getting a little cooked in the heat of the ocean where we are at the moment.
Right. Sounds good. Thank you. Natalie would like to know, and a couple other people want to know as well, how many types of kelp are there?
There's a lot of kelp. So when I talk about kelp, we are talking about a brown algae, specifically brown macroalgae. So there's a lot of different algae in the world, and some of it is micro, which is super small. Some of it is macro. And so for brown macroalgae, there are 5 different types that kind of structure, or at least 5 different families and orders that structure our world. I don't know exactly how many species off the top of my head, but there's at least that many unique combinations that create our kelp forests.
Very cool. Thanks. The next question is from that Pawtucket classroom, Ms. Goldman's class. Richard would like to know, how does kelp start to grow, and how then do you keep it going? So like if you were to plant kelp, what does that all look like?
So kelp reproduces somewhat similar to how a plant might reproduce, where it will release spores into the water, and you'll have your male and your female spores, and they will hopefully encounter each other in our water stream and create a gamete. And that gamete this is the only time that kelp is really moving or has the potential to disperse anymore. And that gamete will settle somewhere and start to grow those little holdfasts onto a rock, hopefully, or some other structure. And then it grows as what we call a sporophyte. And that's what you see is an adult sporophyte, are those big versions of kelp. And there's a second part to that question.
How does it keep growing?
How does it keep growing? Well, it keeps growing by using the sunlight, and it uses the sunlight for photosynthesis, and will continue to grow that way. But yeah.
Cool. The next question is from Alex. What is your favorite type of kelp?
I really like the look of Laminaria digitata. It is really cool, especially when it's super long. And that one, I'll show you again. The Laminaria digitata is this one. And these are photos that I took of my samples. So this one is really cool and it looks crazy, but it's also super slimy sometimes. Ooh. So when it's really slimy, it's less of my favorite. And the Saccharina latissima is also just really gorgeous when it's super full and has the nice ruffles on the edge. So I can't really choose.
Fair enough. That sounds good. The next question is, so in, forests on land, we have forests made up of many different tree species. Do kelp forests generally have one species of kelp or many species of kelp?
they depends. Here, our kelp forests are mainly made out of 2 species. There is another third species that is present, but not as common. And around the world, yeah, there tends to be a few species, but they might be in the same family. So they might be closely related to each other, but dominated by 1 or 2 species.
Sounds good. Thanks. The next question is, how does kelp stay in place and not just get blown around by the currents?
So that's what we were talking about earlier, is the holdfasts. So these holdfasts are really strong, and they kind of create like a root structure that's wrapped around a rock. And that's how they stay in place, which is why making sure that we have these rocky coastlines is what allows our kelp to hold on and stay holding on.
Sounds good. You need rocks to grab onto. Sounds good. The next question is, Jackson would like to know, what animals live in the kelp forest, and are any of them endangered? We talked about otters, urchins, the other urchins, and cod. Who else lives there, and is anybody endangered?
There's a lot of animals that live in them. Depends on where you are in the world as well. Like, for instance, if we went to Australia, you'll see some fishes and some grazing fish. Grazing fish are ones that might actually eat the kelp, like parrotfish that have teeth, they'll eat them. You'll see other organisms here. As we were saying earlier, we're in Maine, so there's lobsters everywhere and there's crabs. We'll see cunner and pollock around our kelp forests here. We'll see seals like swimming through the kelp forest, but not necessarily living in the kelp forests. So you'll see a lot of animals interact around the kelp forest because that's where their prey are, or that's where they find safety or relaxation for a moment, but not necessarily permanently residing in them.
Cool. Sounds good. Next question is from Lisa. Do any animals camouflage in the kelp forest?
Yes. Especially, there's a really cool fish called the kelp fish, I think.
Ooh.
And if you search it, it's in California, and it looks like kelp. And it is a perfect example of how fish can camouflage with kelp.
Very cool. Next question is from Smith. Does kelp grow in fresh water? And if not, are there other plants that can do the same job as kelp, but in lakes?
No and yes. So kelp does not grow in fresh water, but there are other algae that grow in fresh water that provide an environment for species to live in. They might not be as tall and big and structured as the kelps that I research are, but they do create space and environment. Or you might have something like eelgrass or some other greenish looking thing that can do some photosynthesis and create spaces for animals to live.
Very cool. All right. The next question is from Richard. He wants to know, can you eat kelp raw?
You might want to clean it off a little bit first, like get some of the slime or some little snails that might be living on it off. But yeah, I have. It was good.
Cool. Yeah, I think I've definitely eaten seaweed raw. I don't know if I've eaten specifically kelp raw. Let's see. So Mr. Jackaway wants to know, can you reconnect us to the issues of climate and kelp? So like, how is climate helping? Like what is that? How can we connect these two topics?
So kelps are very hardy organisms, and they can grow in different environments, which is why they're around the world. However, in one specific region, like in the Gulf of Maine, they're very well adapted to the environment they're used to. They can grow really well between 12 and 20 degrees Celsius. And what's happening right now is, with our warming waters, we are losing the temperature range that is ideal for the kelp to grow in. So as our temperature of our water shifts, and the kelps, not being very mobile, are starting to have to either adapt to a warmer temperature, or they can somewhat start to migrate northwards. It's a slow process, but that happens. And so what we're currently looking at is the range where our kelps used to be in the Gulf of Maine. We're seeing them kind of start to be depleted on the southern edge, basically closer to the equator, we're losing our kelp forests. And that's because the kelps that are there have been adapted to a certain temperature range that they're no longer experiencing for optimal growth and survival. And the kelps further north, they're still in that kind of healthy range of being able to grow there. So what we're looking at is, are we going to expect the kelps to move more north? Or even more fascinating, are we seeing a genetic disposition to be able to handle the warmer temperatures more? So are the kelps in the south are they adapting to the warmer temperatures? The ones that have started to die off were the ones that couldn't handle the warm temperatures, but the ones that have survived and are reproducing are the ones that are passing along their ability to handle hotter temperatures. So now might we be getting populations that have higher thermal thresholds that can then survive as our ocean warms? So those are like the two really big questions that are constantly on my mind.
Very cool. Sounds important. That's amazing. The next question is from Barrows STEM Academy. They're going to be, or at least one of them is going to be in southern Maine in mid-April. Are there any particular beach ecosystems they should check out for just to see some kelp?
For the most part, if you go any coastline if you're in southern Maine, if you go to like Cape Liz and Portland and York, anywhere where you have rocky edges of Maine, which is like everywhere, most hikes end in these rocky cliffs where you should be able to start to see some of the intertidal kelp, the fucus, but not necessarily the subtidal kelp, which are the kelps I study. Subtidal being that they never appear during the tidal cycles, and intertidal being kelps that you might see when it's low tide because they're exposed to the air, and during high tide, they're covered with water.
Cool. Sounds good. All right, the next question is from Judy. You mentioned turf algae currently being an issue for kelp. Are most of these introduced species, or are they native species that have gotten out of hand from some other factor, maybe the loss of predation or too many nutrients or something like that?
It's a combination. There's always been turf algae in the area. However, when there was kelps in the area, they were basically using up all the sunlight. So the turfs couldn't really grow to a maximum amount because they were at the base of the kelps and they were getting shaded by the kelps. But they were always there. And then when the kelps kind of died off for a bit and you had the sea urchins appear, the turfs saw their moment to grow. And they also tend to have a higher thermal threshold. So that kelp being very sensitive to the changing temperature, these turf algae are able to grow in a warmer temperature already. And so that, combined with the fact that as they grow, they take up more of this rocky area, means that our kelps can't really find that rocky area to grab onto and grow. So the turfs are, some of them are like non-native to the area compared to past years, but a lot of them have been there, but they're just exploding in population because there's this wide open space for them to grow.
Right. Sounds good. All right. The next question has been asked in a slightly different ways a couple different times, but can you only grow kelp underwater?
Yes.
Yes. Cool. Next question. We're coming up at the end, so I'm gonna try to like rapid fire questions at you. All right. Is kelp for sushi raw or dried? Or is it not kelp at all?
It's dried.
Dried. What color can kelp be?
We have brown and green algae. So normally the kelp I see will be between those two colors.
Sounds good. Are there any kelp species that are endangered?
Not that I know of.
Awesome. Do sharks camouflage in kelp?
No, they're a little too big for that, I think.
Sounds good. Do kelp forests, like the main one or the California one, do they have unique microalgae communities?
Probably, especially because those microalgae communities will be based on the environment that they're in, and our Pacific Ocean has a different set of abiotic factors than our Atlantic Ocean.
Sounds good. Where are the largest kelp forests?
My brain would go to California, but who knows?
Sounds good. What is the longest piece of kelp you've ever seen, and where was it?
The longest piece of kelp I ever seen was that picture of me lying next to the Saccharina latissima, and that was up at Schoodic Point in Maine. So that was down East Maine, which actually means North Maine.
Cool. Down East Maine means North Maine. Well, that's a new one to me. Sounds good. All right, very cool. And as you're looking at these different populations of kelp, and are you seeing genetic changes over time?
Well, I currently have 600 pieces of kelp ready for some genetic analysis.
So you'll know in a couple months.
I will know, come back to me in a couple of months, and hopefully I'll have some answers for you.
Awesome. Sounds good. Okay. So we are just about out of time here. Thank you for sharing all of this knowledge with us. This has been so cool and informative. We always ask everybody the same 2 questions at the end of every session. The first is if you had everyone's attention in the whole world and you could tell them anything about your area of expertise, what would you tell them?
That even if it doesn't seem like it is immediately and directly relevant to you, it is.
Cool. All right. And then the next question is, you still have everybody's attention in the world, and you can tell them something about anything, about literally anything. It could be like an opinion about Batman. It could be a life piece of advice. It could be anything. What do you tell them?
That science is an art, and that I really love the combination of the two. And as much as I love STEM, I really love the ability to combine STEM with art, because that's really what makes a lot of connections in the world.
Love that. Science and art. People think of science and art as being opposites. I don't think so.
They're not.
They're really not. They're interacting all the time.
Every research experiment you ever do.
That's right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody at home. Our next session is going to be all about volcanoes. I just put the link in the chat. Oh, wait, I only sent that to hosts and panelists. Let me send that to everybody. There's the link to our next session. It's going to be on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day at 1 p.m. We're going to be talking about volcanoes. It's going to be great. Please come. I hope you have a good time. Thank you for joining us today. This was great. If you want to share this session with anybody else or watch previous sessions, you can do so at youtube.com/SkypeAScientist. Rene, do you have anything else you'd like to say to us? Anywhere that we should be following you on social media or anything like that before we wrap up?
I have a Twitter. It's at Rene Francolini. I'm really terrible at it.
Great.
And yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. Thank you everybody for coming. And of course, Ashley, thank you for interpreting. We appreciate you. And everybody, we'll see you on the 17th. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.